There comes a moment when a woman no longer explains her silence, no longer negotiates her peace, no longer bends her truth to fit the softness of someone else's comfort. Something within her, quiet, ancient, immovable, has awakened. She has crossed the invisible line between pleasing and knowing, between survival and sovereignty. Once she remembers who she is, there is no return to what she once tolerated. But tell me, have you felt that subtle shift when the cost of self betrayal finally outweighed the fear of being misunderstood? Have you noticed how peace begins to feel more natural than approval? The awakening moment. An awakened woman does not rise in noise or fire. She unfolds, cell by cell, breath by breath, until she realizes that what she called breaking was in truth birthing. This awakening is not a rebellion, it's a remembering. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process through which the soul reclaims its fragments and becomes whole. For the awakened woman, this process begins the moment she stops confusing adaptation with love. For years, she wore the masks demanded by culture, family, and fear. She learned the choreography of approval, the careful balance between being kind and being small. But now, her psyche refuses to participate in this performance. Awakening doesn't arrive as thunder. It begins with discomfort, conversations that drain her, promises that taste false on her tongue, a fatigue that feels older than her body. Slowly, she understands. Nothing outside her can validate what she's forgotten inside. Her spirit no longer tolerates the noise of misalignment. She begins to listen inwardly, not for answers, but for resonance. The voice of her true self, long exiled beneath politeness, starts to hum beneath the surface. This is how the transformation begins, through ordinary days that suddenly feel unbearable in their falseness, through the still, soft whisper, no more. Recognition of self energy. She starts to sense, almost magnetically, where her energy ends and others' expectations begin. The empathic woman, who once absorbed everyone's pain like weather, now learns to discern the difference between compassion and contamination. Jung called this differentiation, the sacred art of becoming distinct from the collective psyche. It is the moment the self steps out of the fog of we and reclaims the clarity of I. She no longer sets boundaries as acts of defense. She becomes the boundary itself. Her energy field, once porous from guilt and overgiving, begins to solidify, not as armor, but as presence. She no longer explains why she withdraws from certain conversations, certain people, certain environments. Her silence speaks the language of vibration. I no longer belong here. In this recognition, she feels both grief and relief. Grief for the versions of herself she must now bury, the agreeable, the apologetic, the one who called surrender love. Relief for the vastness that returns once her spirit is no longer compressed by performance. The awakened woman realizes that she does not need to shout her truth to make it valid. Her clarity emits its own frequency. She moves through the world as a tuning fork. What resonates stays, what dissonates falls away naturally. Boundary 1. The line of identity. The first sacred line is the boundary of identity. She refuses to let others define who she is. For too long, her reflection was constructed by mirrors that distorted her. The social persona, the daughter, the lover, the achiever, became a cage made of compliments and expectations. Jung warned that the persona, though necessary, can become tyrannical when mistaken for the self. When she awakens, this mask begins to crack. The smiles she used to offer from habit now tremble with truth. She feels how heavy it is to carry everyone's projections, how exhausting to maintain a version of herself that pleases others but starves her soul. The collapse of the false self feels like death, yet it is the only doorway into authenticity. She no longer seeks to be admired, she longs to be real. Her conversations deepen, her laughter changes timbre. It comes from somewhere grounded, somewhere unperformative. And those who loved her mask often resist her emergence. They say she's changed. They miss the old version, the one who tolerated half-truths. But she smiles softly, knowing that to be truly seen, she must first be willing to disappear from the places where she was never known. Boundary 2. The line of emotional containment. Here she learns the subtle but profound distinction between empathy and enmeshment. She no longer carries other people's storms in her nervous system. For years, she mistook emotional absorption for care. She believed that to love meant to rescue, to feel meant to fix. But this form of empathy was a quiet self-abandonment, a spiritual anemia that left her exhausted. Now, she practices what Jung called conscious feeling, the capacity to witness emotion without identification. She no longer sinks into others' chaos. She observes it with compassion and choice. When someone projects their pain onto her, she no longer internalizes it. She breathes and says inwardly, "This is not mine." Her compassion remains immense, but it has become discerning. She understands that drowning beside someone doesn't save them. It only doubles the suffering. Love that requires self-erasure is not love, but fusion. The awakened woman no longer confuses heaviness with depth. She gives presence, not rescue, understanding, not self-sacrifice. Through this, her heart becomes a sacred vessel rather than a leaking cup. Boundary 3. The line of autonomy. The third line marks the end of justification. She no longer translates her choices into explanations palatable to others. She no longer offers dissertations on why she needs rest, why she walked away, why she said no. She has learned that sovereignty requires no defense. This boundary is forged in fire, the fire of 1,000 small apologies that once preceded her truth. Jung said that individuation is the liberation of the self from collective approval. The awakened woman lives this every day. She no longer waits for permission to be herself. She acts from inner authority. When her intuition whispers, she listens. Even when logic protests, even when others call her irrational, her decisions are not reactive. They are responsive to the wisdom of her deeper nature. She realizes that true freedom is not rebellion but alignment. It is the calm confidence of someone who knows that her life does not need to be understood to be respected. There's a subtle power in the way she now moves, unhurried, unapologetic, unafraid. She no longer seeks to be agreeable. She seeks to be congruent. And when people ask, "Who do you think you are?" she answers, not with words, but with presence, the kind of presence that says, "I am." Boundary 4. The line of respect. Something changes when a woman awakens to her worth. She no longer reacts to disrespect. She simply rises above it. There is no anger in her withdrawal, no performance in her absence, only a quiet recognition that energy speaks louder than confrontation. Jung once said that what we resist persists, but what we withdraw energy from dissolves. The awakened woman has learned this intimately. She doesn't argue with distortion, she disengages. She understands that when she stops feeding disrespect with her attention, it withers like a plant denied light. In the past, she fought to be heard. She explained herself to those committed to misunderstanding. She mistook endurance for loyalty. But awakening reorders her priorities. She realizes that respect is not earned through effort, it's mirrored through energy. Now, when someone crosses this line, she doesn't retaliate, she remembers. She remembers who she is, and remembering becomes her protection. Her silence is not passive, it is boundary embodied. People often interpret her calm as indifference, not realizing that her stillness is a form of power. She has discovered the difference between noise and authority. Authority doesn't shout, it emanates. In her presence, even those who once took her for granted begin to feel the shift. They sense that something sacred within her no longer negotiates its value. And that realization, more than any confrontation, becomes the lesson. Boundary 5. The line of projection. Here lies one of the most subtle and essential boundaries of awakening. The awakened woman recognizes when someone projects their unhealed shadow onto her. She has become fluent in the language of psychic transfer, the way others cast their hidden fears, envies, and insecurities onto those who refuse to carry their burdens. In the past, she absorbed these projections unconsciously. She became what others needed her to be, the scapegoat, the savior, the emotional sponge. But Jung taught that until the shadow is integrated, it seeks expression through others. And she, being empathic and open, was often chosen as the screen. Now she sees it for what it is, a mirror test. When criticism arrives, she pauses. Does it resonate as truth, or does it feel foreign, heavy, misplaced? If it feels foreign, she returns it without hostility. "This is not mine," she whispers, not in defiance, but in clarity. She practices what Jung might have called psychic hygiene, clearing her energetic field daily, not from superstition, but from self-respect. She understands that every emotional exchange carries residue, and that consciousness must remain clean if it is to remain free. This boundary frees her from unnecessary guilt. She no longer assumes responsibility for other people's discomfort with her truth. She knows that when her light triggers someone's shadow, it reveals where they are still asleep, not where she is wrong. Projection used to wound her deeply. Now, it informs her. Every accusation becomes data, an invitation to discern what belongs to her and what belongs to the collective unconscious. Through this discernment, she reclaims vast amounts of energy once wasted on defending herself from illusions. Her peace grows as her need to correct others fades. The awakened woman understands that truth requires no defense. It simply continues being true. Boundary 6. The line of integrity in relationships. This is the boundary of wholeness, the most painful and liberating of them all. She no longer participates in relationships that require her to fragment herself. No matter how much love, history, or longing is involved, she refuses to remain where authenticity must be sacrificed to maintain harmony. Once she believed that love meant endurance, that to care was to carry, to forgive endlessly, to absorb dysfunction in the name of compassion. But now she knows that love, when mature, does not demand self-abandonment. Jung wrote that every relationship is a psychological experiment, two unconsciousnesses meeting to see if awakening can occur. The awakened woman refuses to play roles that keep the experiment unconscious. If the connection requires her silence, she steps away. If it requires her to shrink, she expands elsewhere. If it demands her to forget what she knows, she chooses remembrance over romance. This boundary is not born of pride, but of integrity. She no longer sacrifices her truth to preserve illusions. She understands that every act of self-betrayal accumulates as psychic debt, one that must eventually be paid in the currency of fatigue, resentment, or disease. Now, she protects her wholeness like sacred ground. Her love becomes a refining force rather than a collapsing one. Those who meet her must meet themselves in her presence. Her energy no longer accommodates pretense. Sometimes this means walking away from those she still loves. The departure hurts, but it doesn't destroy her. Because she knows, leaving what diminishes her is an act of devotion to the divine within. And when she walks away, it is not a rejection but a ritual, a declaration that her soul can no longer trade authenticity for attachment. Boundary 7. The line of truth. Truth, for the awakened woman, is not a philosophy, it's oxygen. She can no longer betray her intuition to keep the peace. She knows that every false agreement suffocates her soul. Jung taught that what we repress does not disappear, it descends into the unconscious and corrodes from within. She refuses to live in corrosion. This line is simple but absolute. She will not lie to herself, not for comfort, not for company, not for survival. Where once she chose polite silence over awkward honesty, she now chooses clear truth over comfortable illusion. Her voice carries the resonance of inner alignment. She knows that truth may cost her relationships, but it will never cost her integrity, and integrity is her new currency. She no longer fears conscious conflict. She knows that real peace cannot exist where truth is unspoken. False harmony once felt safe, now it feels like poison. She recognizes that every lie, no matter how small, extracts a piece of her soul, so she lives in transparency, not perfect, but clean. Her yes means yes, her no means no. She no longer manipulates outcomes or hides her depth to make others comfortable. Her relationships simplify. They either rise to meet her vibration or dissolve naturally, and in that dissolution she feels no malice, only gratitude for clarity, because truth, even when it breaks, always sets free. In these 7 boundaries, the awakened woman is not building walls, she is building coherence. Each line she draws is a hymn to wholeness, a declaration that her life now belongs to the self that once whispered in dreams, "Remember me." Her awakening is not rebellion, it's restoration, not resistance, but return. When a woman finally aligns with her truth, the world around her rearranges. What no longer matches her frequency quietly drifts away, not in drama, but in natural law. People who once relied on her compliance feel her withdrawal like a sudden silence after years of background music. They call her distant, cold, changed. But she knows what has really shifted. She is no longer available for what drains her. Jung taught that when one integrates the self, life reorganizes around that new center. It is not she who isolates, it is falseness that falls away. The universe responds with exquisite precision. Invitations lessen, conversations narrow, but authenticity deepens. She no longer fills her days with noise or people who mistake access for intimacy. Solitude, once feared, now becomes sacred space. She realizes that her aloneness is not a deficiency, it is a sanctuary. Inside this quiet, she meets herself anew. The voice of her intuition, once buried beneath the demands of others, begins to speak with crystalline clarity. There's a stillness to her life now, like a forest after a storm. Some days it feels empty, yes, but even the emptiness has texture, alive, waiting, pregnant with newness. She senses that this emptiness is not absence but capacity, space for what is true to enter. This is the paradox of awakening. You lose almost everything you thought you needed, and in that loss, you gain what you truly are. Transformation of relationships. Her relationships undergo quiet revolutions. Quantity gives way to quality. The crowd thins, but the circle deepens. Those who remain can feel her transformation. She no longer responds to manipulation or guilt. Her compassion has become crystalline, clear, not porous. She listens without absorbing, gives without depleting, loves without losing herself. Jung observed that individuation naturally transforms outer relationships because the inner archetypes have rearranged themselves. The woman who once carried the archetype of the giver begins to embody the queen, not in egoic rule, but in self-governed wholeness. The people drawn to her now are not those who need saving, but those who seek truth. They are mirrors, not dependents, companions, not distractions. Conversations evolve. Small talk feels foreign. Instead, her dialogue revolves around meaning, depth, and growth. The air of her presence cleanses. People either rise to meet it or quietly fade. She notices something subtle. When she stopped chasing connection, authentic connection began chasing her. Her vibration itself became an invitation for souls aligned with her integrity. And when someone new enters her orbit, she no longer asks, "Do they like me?" She asks, "Do I feel like myself when I'm with them?" That question changes everything. Relationships now become spaces of reflection rather than projection. They no longer revolve around fixing or completing each other, but around witnessing each other's unfolding. She has learned that love, in its highest form, is freedom, and freedom cannot exist without boundaries. The cost of awakening. Yet this clarity comes at a price. Every rebirth requires burial. She has buried versions of herself that once held her world together. The obedient one, the people pleaser, the woman who mistook tolerance for strength. They were her guardians once, but now they stand like old skins she can no longer inhabit. There are nights when she grieves them, nights when she wonders if awakening was worth the loneliness it demanded. The journey of selfhood can feel merciless in its honesty. Jung called this confrontation with the self a sacred ordeal, the death of all illusions that once made life bearable. But then, in the midst of this quiet mourning, something miraculous occurs. She begins to feel peace not as an idea, but as an atmosphere, the kind of peace that no longer depends on certainty or company, the kind that arises when every mask has fallen away and what remains is simply truth. She discovers that authenticity may cost relationships, but inauthenticity costs the soul, and the soul, once reclaimed, compensates her a thousandfold, with creativity, with clarity, with an unshakable sense of meaning. This is the price of awakening. You lose illusions, but you gain reality. You lose approval, but you gain integrity. You lose noise, but you gain music. And though it hurts, it's a holy kind of pain, the kind that sculpts freedom. The calm of arrival. There comes a morning, unremarkable in appearance, sacred in essence, when she realizes she is no longer searching. She wakes and feels no war inside, no striving to prove, no impulse to chase, no residue of resentment, only presence. Her energy, once scattered across timelines and people, returns home to her body. She moves slowly, intentionally, as though time itself has softened around her. She eats when hungry, speaks when truth calls, rests when silence asks. She no longer forces alignment, it happens through her, not by her. Jung described individuation as the moment the conscious and unconscious enter dialogue instead of battle. She now embodies that dialogue. Her mind no longer overrules her intuition. Her heart no longer overrides her boundaries. Every part of her finally speaks the same language. People sense it before she does. They call her peaceful, radiant, grounded. But she knows what it really is: integration. Her spirit and psyche have ceased being strangers. Her energy no longer leaks into other stories. It circulates within her own sacred ecosystem. This is what true sovereignty feels like. Not dominance, not separation, but a gentle coherence. Her life is no longer built on reaction, but resonance. Where she once defended her boundaries with effort, now she simply embodies them. Her presence itself communicates what words once tried to explain. Disrespect cannot enter what it cannot reach. Her energy has become her protection. And so she walks through the world differently, not higher but deeper. She carries no anger toward those who crossed her before. She understands they only met the unhealed version of her. The woman she is now requires no revenge, only reverence for the lessons that sculpted her strength. Closing message. Perhaps as you read this, you feel a quiet recognition stirring in your chest, a knowing that you too are somewhere along this sacred path, from pleasing to presence, from survival to selfhood. If so, know this: the boundaries you build are not walls, they are bridges back to your essence. They are the architecture of your awakening. You are not becoming hard, you are becoming whole. And as you rise in your clarity, you call other women to remember theirs. So breathe, stand tall in your quiet power. You are not losing your softness, you are remembering its sacred form. The world does not need your compliance, it needs your coherence, and that, beloved, is the truest boundary of all.